And so when you have people, and we interview a number of Freemasons in the film, and you have people like Masonic apologist Brent Morris saying that he thinks the Illuminati lasted about 10 years and then they went out of style or whatever, that idea is smashed by somebody like Dr. Billington, who shows that they were very influential, and they continue to be influential throughout all of these revolutions that took place across Europe and then went over to China and Cuba and so on, that it's the same philosophy that's driving this movement around the world.
One thing I want to ask you, Chris, something that I've noticed that plays a central role in a lot of your documentaries is the central role of the Freemasons. It seems like you found their handprints on a lot of things, different areas that you cover, and it's not just you that's noticed that. I know there's many other secular people that do research and dramatic work. Even the recent movies have shown about some kind of caretaker role of the Masons and looking over our famous structures in America and things like that. That is a real lightning rod as far as this whole concept of Freemasons, very controversial within even people of faith to talk about this. Can you explain things a little bit further about who you think they are, what role they play? How should we look at all this from a Christian perspective?
Well, it's very, very important for Christians to understand Freemasonry, because Freemasonry has, for well over 100 years, infiltrated Christian churches. You've got thousands and thousands of Freemasons who have specifically sought out positions of leadership as pastors and elders and deacons and so on in church groups throughout the Southeast especially, and across America. I ran into in fact, when I was first studying Freemasonry when I was out in California, I was noticing that at the church that I was going to, there were a lot of really bizarre doctrinal issues going on. And to make a long story short, I encountered a number of Freemasons there who were deeply embedded in the church, part of the leadership there, and they were espousing all of these New Age Freemasonic doctrines. And I confronted them, with scriptures, and tried to stay away from conspiracy theories I had heard and just talk to them about biblical issues, where they were promoting many paths to God and how we should embrace all religions and this kind of thing. And this was very early in my Christian walk, but I knew enough to know, Paul writing to the Corinthians, saying, I tell you that the sacrifice which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And he says, and I would not that you have fellowship with demons. And he says, you cannot eat bread from the table of the Lord and from the table of demons. You cannot drink from the cup of the Lord and from the cup of demons. Do we provoke God to anger? Are we stronger than He? And so on. And so I said to this particular deacon in the church, who was a Mason and a 32nd degree Mason, I said, just based upon what you're telling me about Freemasonry, that's contrary to what the Word of God tells us. So how can you promote this belief system and be a part of it and so on and be a leader in the church and be a Christian and still have to do with this whole thing? And that stirred up a whole conflict in the church that I was attending at the time. But that church went slowly, one step at a time, down an ecumenical path. In Megiddo 1, when we released it, we have a small section in there where we talk about Freemasonry. Nevertheless, when it aired on Sky Angel, that was probably the one section that we would get the most phone calls about, because people would call from all over the country and say, I've got, my dad is a Freemason, my uncle's a Freemason, I've got a cousin or a nephew or somebody who's getting involved in Masonry or is involved in Masonry. I'm trying to find out how to, witness to them, etc., and so on. I remember having a woman call me probably a year and a half ago, telling me that the pastor of her church was a Mason and that he was actively trying to get other Freemasons to come and join the church there. And they were forming kind of a Masonic nucleus there in the leadership. okay, and trying to take the church in a new direction. These things are still going on. You've got, the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, in the last 2 years, released a whole lot of documentaries where they were trying to brush away the conspiracy theories about Freemasonry, say, oh, that's all nonsense, really. The Masons are good guys, they're just American patriots, etc., and so on, and don't believe those silly conspiracy theories. You had in January of 2007, the new Congress, the Democratic Congress, releases the House Resolution 33, which was specifically engineered to honor the Freemasons of America. This is a year ago. A little over a year ago they did this.
Yeah, you can look that up on the Internet.
Yeah, it's on the Internet. We show it in Riddles in Stone, but you can find it. But it's in that House resolution. Now, this is the American government is acknowledging that most of the founding fathers of America were Freemasons. Most of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Freemasons. Now, you hear Masonic apologists come out, and they try to diffuse all of this information and say, oh, well, that's not true, and this kind of thing. But it doesn't get more official than the U.S. Congress. It doesn't get more official than that, and if the Masons were no longer important, or if they were on the decline, or this kind of thing, why does the Congress, when we have so many problems in the country, the new Congress comes into office and they have nothing better to do than to come up with, within a month now of taking power, they come up with this House resolution to honor the Freemasons?
You know, what's curious, too, is that they've done a lot to try to distance themselves from religious organizations and try to take religion out of regular workings of government. But this is the closest thing to it when they go back and particularly recognize one type of pseudo-religious group as opposed to others to spell out specifically.
Yeah, and on that note, Dr. Future, as you saw toward the beginning of Riddles in Stone, we show the cornerstone laying ceremony for the U.S. Capitol when the Masons did a reenactment of it back in, well, it's been some years, but within the last 10 years or so, I'm trying to remember, I think it was in 1995 or 96, but anyway, when they did that, you've got all these Masons there in their Masonic aprons and so on, and they're lifting up their prayers, they're able to have their ceremonies, and they're able to acknowledge their God, and nobody else is able to do that, but they let the Freemasons do it because that has become the religion of America. It is this Masonic religion, this embracing of all the gods as one and the same. And that's the religion that is promoted on Fox News. That's the religion that's promoted in the military, where they'll often talk about God and so on, but they make it clear that they want all the gods included.
Chris, you have actually mentioned earlier in our discussion Mr. Manly P. Hall, and I know another gentleman you talk about in your documentaries as well as another critical figure by the name of Albert Pike. Can you explain to our listeners, if they're not completely familiar with who these people are, and I would imagine that they're not as familiar as they should be, even if they do have a casual understanding, can you explain what the key contributions these gentlemen have done to the work that you've uncovered?
Well, they're probably I might call them the 19th and 20th century fathers of American Freemasonry. Albert Pike is the designer of Scottish Rite Masonry, which is the most popular form of Freemasonry in America. Usually when you hear about a president or a politician or a famous leader in America who was a Mason, he's usually a Scottish Rite Mason. And sometimes the Masons will argue and they'll say, oh, well, he was just over the southern jurisdiction. But the southern jurisdiction, when they say that, is based in Washington, D.C. It's right there in the House of the Temple, right in the midst of all of the political epicenter of Washington, D.C. And so it is the most powerful arm of Freemasonry anywhere in America. And the Sovereign Grand Commander, one of the more popular modern sovereign grand commanders was a guy named Siegfried Kleinknecht, and we actually show a picture of him at some point. He initiated President Ronald Reagan, while he was president, initiated Reagan as an honorary 33rd degree Mason. So that's the kind of influence that the Sovereign Grand Commander of Scottish Rite Masonry can have.
I don't know if I shared with you a little trivia tidbit I found immediately after an earlier interview we did with you for Future Quake about Mr. Kleinknecht.
Sure.
Did I mention about the role of his son within NASA?
You did. I remember that.
I think it's very interesting. Most people don't know the key role that the Department of Defense has over NASA, and that they actually have by statute a requirement and a capability to review any kind of data that comes from outer space that for some reason has a military security issue, whatever that might be. They have a right to be able to review it and to classify this information. And the gentleman who's the gatekeeper, that's the first person to see anything that comes out of NASA, any of their results, and decides what the public gets to see, is, believe it or not, the son of Mr. Kleinknecht.
Wow.
And
Really?
in fact, yes, I was surprised, and if I had not known your documentary, I wouldn't have been able to put two and two together. But it's very ironic to know that every man who has set foot on the moon is a verifiable 33rd degree Mason, as well as every mission commander at NASA. I know that sounds incredibly conspiratorial, but it's easily documentable.
If the facts lead there, then the facts lead there.
May or may not be that significant, but I just find it very curious.
Well, it actually is, I think, because if you go to the House of the Temple, I remember when I was there, we have some footage of it, but when you go downstairs underground, they have an inner room where they have display cases, but they have a whole wall dedicated to NASA and the space program. And the Masons take a lot of pride in the space program. In fact, they claim a kind of ownership to it, if that makes any sense.
With their worship of the stars and what you talk about, their reverence for the star Sirius and other things like this,
right.
It would make only sense that they would want to be involved in something if it had anything but just a mystical significance to them, to have some involvement of being able to touch the stars, even if in a metaphorical sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Albert Pike, just to round things out with him, the guy who designed all these higher degrees in Scottish Rite Masonry, and whose book, Morals and Dogma, they continue to teach, even though they use an abbreviated form of it called A Bridge to Light. But that is continually taught to all Scottish Rite Freemasons, which becomes very disturbing because Pike was greatly influenced by an occultist, a guy who was in no uncertain way a Luciferian, a Satanist, named Eliphas Levi. And Pike in Morals and Dogma quotes whole passages and even chapters from Levi's work, and he puts them into Morals and Dogma. And in fact, one of his, Pike says two things. He says that the ultimate purpose of Masonry is a continual progression toward the light. And then he says, in his book, and he's quoting Eliphas Levi, he says, Lucifer, is it he who bears the light? Doubt it not. So he acknowledges that Masonry is about moving toward the light, but then he makes it clear that Lucifer is the one who bears that light. Pike teaches in Morals and Dogma a principle that I believe is clearly embraced by the three great teachers of the 19th and 20th century in this regard: Pike, Madame Blavatsky, and then Manly P. Hall, who was the second that you talked about. But what all three of these did was their writings, their books and so on, that they compiled, were compilations of going and looking at ancient manuscripts and ancient cultures and traditions and beliefs and so on, and amassing all of this data about the ancient mystery religions and compiling them in their books. For Pike, it was Morals and Dogma. Blavatsky, it was The Secret Doctrine. And then Manly Hall, it was The Secret Teachings of All Ages. But those three works are very similar in terms of what they did and how they were influenced. But what Pike taught and what Manly Hall taught is what Madame Blavatsky describes as demon est deus inversus. That's the phrase that means the devil is God inverted.